You already know what it feels like to walk into a room and immediately sense that someone else controls it. You have been in negotiations where you felt the outcome was decided before you sat down. You have watched certain people move through every social environment they enter and somehow always come out on top. Not because they were the smartest person there, not because they were the loudest, but because something invisible was working in their favor before the conversation even started. You have felt that gap between you and those people and wondered what they know that you do not. This video closes that gap permanently. What those people are doing, consciously or not, is deploying a system that Rome operationalized 2,000 years ago and that military academies still study today. 5 psychological weapons, used in sequence, used deliberately, and every single one of them is available to you right now, in your workplace, in your relationships, in every room where power is being decided. By the end of this video, you will not just understand these weapons, you will know exactly how to use them. Military academies still study Roman psychological operations today, not as history, as deployable doctrine, because the 5 weapons Rome used against its enemies 2,000 years ago map with almost perfect precision onto the psychological mechanisms that modern behavioral science has spent decades trying to name. Rome didn't have neuroscience. Rome had something more valuable: centuries of empirical testing against real enemies with real consequences for failure. What they discovered was a truth about human psychology that has not changed in 2 millennia. The mind, once conquered, stays conquered. The body, once conquered, revolts. Rome chose to win minds first. Everything else followed. Here is the complete system. Here is how you use it. The first weapon is the one that starts working before you enter the room, before you say a single word, before anyone has met you. Weapon 1, reputation engineering. Win before you arrive. By the height of Julius Caesar's Gallic campaigns, entire tribes were surrendering before his legions came within marching distance. Not to the reality of Roman military force, they had never faced it directly, to the story of it, which Caesar had spent years carefully constructing and distributing through every available channel. Traders carried it, captured prisoners carried it, deliberately released scouts carried it back to enemy commanders. The message was consistent, specific, and engineered to produce one outcome: the belief that resistance against Caesar was not a military calculation, but a death wish. By the time his legions arrived, the psychological battle was over. The physical battle was almost unnecessary. Reputation is not what you are. It is what people believe you are before they meet you. And what people believe before they meet you determines how they treat you when they do. Caesar understood this with a precision that most people never reach in an entire lifetime. He did not wait for his reputation to form organically through accumulated experiences. He constructed it deliberately. He managed what information reached which people at which moments. He understood that human beings do not independently assess most situations. They assess what the consensus around them believes about a situation and calibrate their own response accordingly. Control the consensus. You control the response. Here is how you deploy this in your own life starting immediately. You do not wait for people to experience you and form their own conclusions. You decide what they believe before they arrive at their own judgment. You manage what information about you reaches which people. You ensure that the right people hear about your capabilities, your track record, and your results, not through boasting, which triggers skepticism, but through the same channels Caesar used: third parties, shared contexts, stories that travel without your fingerprints on them, the colleague who mentions your work in a meeting you are not in, the result that gets attributed to you before you walk into the room. The reputation that precedes you is not vanity, it is infrastructure. Build it the way Rome built roads, deliberately, durably, and before you need it. Weapon 2, strategic silence. Let their imagination fight for you. Before major sieges, Roman commanders did something that violated every instinct of military aggression. They surrounded the target completely, every gate, every supply route, every communication channel, and then did absolutely nothing. No assault, no demand for surrender, no catapults, just total encirclement followed by absolute silence. Days of it, sometimes weeks, and inside the walls, something far more destructive than any physical assault was happening. The human imagination, deprived of information, and given nothing but time and a threat it could not resolve, was generating every possible catastrophic outcome simultaneously. Rome had not attacked. Rome had simply created the conditions for the enemy to attack themselves, from the inside with their own fear, without a single Roman casualty. Modern psychology calls this anticipatory anxiety, and research consistently shows it produces more psychological damage than the actual threat it anticipates. The brain cannot leave an unresolved threat alone. It generates scenarios to fill the vacuum. It escalates. It catastrophizes. It drains the exact resources, clarity, confidence, coordination that would be needed to respond effectively when the moment arrives. Caesar understood this not from neuroscience but from watching it work. He used silence the way a sculptor uses negative space, not as emptiness, as the thing that gives the positive elements their power. Deploy this and watch what happens to the dynamic in any high-stakes situation you are currently navigating. Stop over-explaining. Stop filling every pause with reassurance. Stop responding immediately to every message the moment it arrives. Silence deployed with intention is pressure that costs you nothing to apply. In a negotiation, the person who speaks first after a pause needed the resolution more. Let them need it. In a conflict, the person who over-explains is signaling that they require the other person's approval of their position. Remove that signal. In any situation where someone is waiting on your response, the wait itself is communicating something about where the power sits. Caesar did not assault cities immediately because the waiting was already winning. Apply the same logic. Your silence is not absence. It is a weapon. Use it deliberately. Weapon 3, divide and doubt. Destroy unity before it can form. Caesar was facing a unified Gallic coalition in 52 BCE, something Rome genuinely could not defeat if it held together. So Caesar's first move was not military. He sent simultaneous but different messages to different tribal leaders. Told one that another had been secretly negotiating with Rome. Told a third that the first two had already reached a private agreement. None of it was true. All of it was plausible enough to activate existing competitive tensions between leaders who all wanted dominance within the coalition. By the time Vercingetorix was attempting to coordinate a unified military response, he was doing so against a background of mutual suspicion that Caesar had precisely seeded. Leaders who should have been coordinating were monitoring each other. The energy that should have been directed outward was consuming itself internally. Caesar did not defeat that coalition militarily. He dissolved it psychologically before the first engagement. The mechanism exploits a fundamental feature of human social psychology. Negative information about others is believed more readily than positive information, particularly when competitive tensions already exist. Caesar did not need his messages to be convincing from scratch. He needed them to be plausible enough to activate what was already there. The tinder existed. He provided the spark. That distinction matters enormously for how you deploy this weapon in your own environment. You do not manufacture conflict from nothing. You identify existing tensions and introduce the precise question at the precise moment that allows those tensions to redirect themselves away from you and toward each other. This is the weapon that operates entirely below the surface. Nobody sees it working. They only experience the results. When you face a coalition of competing interests that would be dangerous if unified against you, in a workplace, in a negotiation, in any environment where multiple parties have competing stakes, your first move is not to engage it directly. Your first move is to examine where the existing fractures are and what information, if it reached the right person at the right moment, would cause those fractures to widen naturally. You are not lying. You are asking questions. You are making observations. You are ensuring that each party is aware of what the others stand to gain at their expense. Caesar did not create the rivalries between Gallic tribal leaders. He simply made sure each of them remembered that the others had the same rivalries, that remembering did the rest. Weapon 4, symbolic dominance. Control the environment before the conversation. When Roman legions entered new territory, the first thing they built was not a fort. It was a road, straight, paved, engineered to Roman standards, cutting through the landscape with a geometric precision that no local infrastructure could match. Then camps, then temples, then aqueducts. The physical transformation of the landscape was not incidental to Roman conquest. It was a psychological operation running in parallel with every military campaign. The message was not delivered in words. It was delivered in stone, in engineering, in the visible reorganization of the physical world according to Roman order. The message was this: we have already decided this is ours. The question of whether you agree does not change the outcome, and the populations that encountered this transformation did not need to be told to adjust their behavior. The environment itself communicated who held power. They adjusted because the world around them was already Rome's world. Modern behavioral research on environmental psychology confirms what Roman generals understood empirically. When human beings encounter an environment organized according to someone else's system, their psychological orientation shifts from resistance toward accommodation. The brain interprets organized, durable, high-quality infrastructure as evidence of legitimate and permanent authority, not through conscious decision, through the accumulated signal of everything the environment is communicating below the level of conscious awareness. Rome built roads before it built anything else because roads were not just logistics. They were the first and most visible evidence that Rome had already won the long game. Every person who walked them was, in a small but cumulative way, accepting that this was now Rome's world. You have this weapon available in every interaction you will have today. Most people never think to use it. You decide where meetings happen. You decide the arrangement of the space. You decide whether you are already present and settled when the other person arrives, or whether you enter after them. You decide the pace of the conversation, whether it moves at your rhythm or theirs. You decide how much preparation and infrastructure you bring to the interaction versus how much you leave to improvisation. Every one of these decisions is communicating something about where the power sits before a single substantive word is exchanged. The person who has thought about the environment has already won the first engagement. Build your roads, then invite people to walk them. Weapon 5. Clementia. Create loyalty that cannot be bought or threatened. Caesar called it Clementia, divine mercy. And it was, in every way that matters, the most psychologically sophisticated weapon in Rome's entire arsenal. After defeating enemies who expected death, who had been told by their commanders that Roman victory meant Roman slaughter, Caesar spared them, not quietly, publicly, deliberately, with ceremony and full visibility. He returned weapons. He restored dignity. He gave defeated commanders positions of genuine honor within Roman administration. He elevated men who had openly opposed him to roles of real authority, and in doing so, he created something that no military force in history has ever produced by compulsion alone. Psychological debt so complete it functioned as unbreakable loyalty, not because they calculated that loyalty was strategically optimal, because they felt it, below the level of calculation, below the level of rational assessment, as a debt that could never be fully repaid. The mechanism is rooted in reciprocity, one of the most robust and consistent findings in all of social psychology. When a person receives something they did not expect, did not earn, and cannot easily repay, the psychological obligation it creates is qualitatively different from any contractual or incentive-based commitment. It bypasses the rational evaluation system entirely. Former enemies who expected death and received mercy did not decide to be loyal to Caesar. They became loyal to Caesar in the same way a person becomes loyal to someone who saved their life, not through analysis but through a felt sense of permanent obligation that no subsequent argument or incentive could easily dislodge. Caesar spent almost nothing deploying this weapon. Its returns were incalculable. This is the weapon most people in your life are not using, which means the person who starts using it immediately holds an advantage that compounds with every deployment. Identify the moment when someone expects a standard or negative response from you. The moment when giving less would be entirely justified, when no one would question a measured or transactional reaction. Then give significantly more than that, publicly where possible, without attaching a condition, without signaling that you expect something in return. The absence of an explicit condition is precisely what makes the psychological debt so durable. It cannot be discharged by a single reciprocal act because no reciprocal act was specified. Caesar's enemies who received Clementia spent years trying to find a way to adequately repay it. They never could. That inability was the bond. Deploy this precisely at the right moment with the right person, and you will create a form of loyalty that no competitor can purchase and no threat can dissolve. 5 weapons, each one a complete psychological operation in its own right, each one more powerful when combined with the others. Caesar did not use these randomly or reactively. He used them as a coordinated sequence. Reputation engineering before arrival, silence during the waiting period, division of any coalition that might form against him, environmental control in every space where decisions were made, and mercy for anyone who came through the other side of a confrontation. By the time physical force was ever required, the psychological battle was already decided. You now have the complete system. Here is exactly how to deploy all 5. The deployment, how to use all 5 starting now. Reputation engineering is yours. You no longer wait for people to experience you and form their own conclusions. You construct what they believe before they arrive. You manage the story that precedes you into every room, every negotiation, every new relationship. You ensure the right information reaches the right people through the right channels, not through self-promotion, but through the same indirect distribution Caesar used. Traders, prisoners, release scouts. In your world, that is the colleague who mentions your work, the result that gets attributed to you before you walk in, the third party who carries your reputation into conversations you are not part of. By the time someone meets you, they have already decided something about you. From this point forward, you decide what that something is. Strategic silence is yours. You no longer fill every uncomfortable pause with explanation, justification, or reassurance. You no longer respond immediately to every message the moment it arrives. You no longer over-explain decisions that require no explanation. Silence deploys deployed with intention, is pressure that costs you nothing to apply. The person who speaks first after a pause needed the resolution more. The person who over-explains is signaling approval seeking. The person who responds immediately is signaling availability without scarcity. Remove all three signals. Replace them with deliberate, unhurried response at a pace that communicates exactly one thing. Your time and attention are not infinitely available, and whoever receives them should recognize the value of that. Divide and doubt is yours. When you face any environment where a coalition of interests could form against your position, your first move is to map the existing fractures. Every coalition has them: competing ambitions, unequal stakes, histories that predate the current alignment. You do not create these fractures. You locate them and introduce the precise question or observation that allows them to widen naturally. You are never directly involved. You are always adjacent, the calmest, most reasonable presence in any conflict between others, while managing, with precision, which direction it resolves. Caesar did this to an empire. You can do it to a meeting room. Symbolic dominance is yours. From this point forward, you think about the environment of every significant interaction before that interaction occurs, where it happens, how the space is arranged, who arrives first and who enters second, what you bring to the space, preparation, infrastructure, visible evidence of investment versus what you leave unaddressed. Every one of these decisions is a communication that lands before the first word is spoken. The person who has thought about the environment has already won the opening engagement. Rome built roads before legions. Build your roads, arrange your spaces, control the architecture of the interactions where your outcomes get decided, and clementia is yours, the most powerful and least understood weapon in the entire system, and the one that costs the least to deploy. Identify the moments when someone expects a standard or negative response from you. Give significantly more than that, publicly, without conditions, without signaling expectation of return. The psychological debt this creates operates below the level of rational calculation. It cannot be discharged by a single reciprocal act, which means it compounds over time into something closer to genuine loyalty than anything you could incentivize or threaten into existence. Caesar converted enemies into advocates with this weapon. You can convert competitors into allies, skeptics into supporters, and opponents into people who find it psychologically impossible to move against you. Deploy it precisely. Deploy it deliberately. Deploy it at the moment when it will be most unexpected and therefore most powerful. Rome defeated enemies before the first sword was drawn because Rome understood something every other civilization was still trying to learn through force. Win the mind first. Everything else follows. The empire that understood human psychology more completely than any civilization before it lasted 1,000 years. The empires that relied on force alone fell in decades. You now have what made the difference. 5 weapons, tested across centuries, proven against real opposition, available to you starting in the next conversation you walk into. Use them deliberately. Subscribe to Mentis Arcana. The doctrine continues.